Hello again, Bob.
Hello.
Good to see you, sir.
As always.
I've had the luxury of inviting my friend out, Bob Bleacher. He and I want to talk about a lot of things, but we need to package it in a way that we can talk about one thing at a time.
Let's try it.
A lot of things to talk about, right,
Yes,
Bob?
it's true.
So Bob and I have developed a great relationship as friends, educators, fellow educators. But more than that, I think just fellow truth seekers.
Yeah, for sure.
Did you say that?
Yeah.
And you've been around this planet a little bit longer than I have, but I think we want to get to the same place. You know.
I hope so.
Yeah.
We're trying.
Yeah. So why don't you, Bob, introduce what our topic is today in a way that you best understand it.
Well, the way I understand it, we've been talking about the processes of social change. Mm-hmm. That's how I understand it. And we're living in a world where more and more people see the necessity for real fundamental change in the way that we see reality, in the way that we live our lives, in the way that society is organized. Mm-hmm. And this is an issue which only seems to become more urgent. Mm-hmm. And so the question that I know you and I have been talking about is, where would the starting point be for this process of social change to really, shall we say, to really start in a way that is constructive, creative, effective. And I think we settled on our starting point as being at the level of the individual. Mm-hmm. Like, individual change precedes social change, and the number one, shall we say, the most foundational change at the individual level involves a change in the way that we see ourselves, mm-hmm. in the way that we view our own identity. Mm-hmm. As human beings. Yep. And so I think we start with the question of identity.
I think it's a great starting point. I don't think there's any doubt about it that everybody feels what you were talking about, the sense of social change, economic change, political change, whatever we want to call the change. It's coming. It's coming. And people, I think, in an interesting spiritual kind of way, like we'll get to mm-hmm. someday, there's a human antenna that is collecting that message on every human being. They don't know mm-hmm. what frequency it necessarily may be, but they definitely know change is in the air.
Oh, for sure.
You know?
Yeah, there's such an energy. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So, and packing up or dealing with young people like we have for our careers, kids are no different than what you and I are in that they would like to know the truth. They would like to know what the search of truth might look like. Yeah. But they would also love to, I think, know themselves. And people, can we be, I guess, self-critical? You know, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the journey of what's creating the identity for individuals that many people, I don't know but they're adhering to such strict definitions of identical bumpers or fence rails that they butt up against. To think mm-hmm. outside that mm-hmm. is unsettling, and yet that's what we all feel that we're living through.
Yeah, I agree. My sense is that the beginning of the search for truth starts with the truth of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And if we are grounded clearly and certainly in a true sense of our own identity, that enables us to, shall we say, go out in the world and act with certainty. Mm. And I find many people today are sort of paralyzed in the sense that they feel unable to act, and they're living in a sense of doubt. Mm-hmm. And they're unsure of their own abilities to, shall we say, discern what is true from what is false. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is paralyzing. But if I had to say, though, what is the most fundamental truth of our life, it would be the truth of who we are, what gives our life meaning and purpose. Mm-hmm. And the more certain we are about that, the easier it is for us, the more natural it is for us to go out into the world and actually act upon our convictions. It's that idea. So to me, that's why the question of identity is fundamental.
And at the core of the fundamental of identity, maybe I stumbled upon it a little bit later in life, but a spiritual center, and is how a lot of people maybe begin to identify themselves. And I've mentioned this to you before, but that every class that I teach, I'm having kids understand that the interpretation of history and what it means, the things that have happened in this world and what they mean, is looked at through the lens of whether you believe in a higher order of the universe or whether you don't. And if you don't know that about yourself yet, how you're perceiving the world around you, then your identity can be and will be manipulated by others. You'll be vulnerable to others' identical or identity-driven agendas, maybe.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I think all that's true. And in terms of, like, where do you start with that? I would say that in society today, as most of us are taught in, say, a modern secular society like the United States, is we're really taught that the only reality that exists for certain is material reality. And I think that yes, of course, we do live within a material reality, but a fuller understanding of that includes a spiritual reality. And when I use the word spiritual, I think what I'm saying is something that's not physical. Like, there are aspects of reality that are not physical. They're not quantifiable. They're not measurable. And maybe the easiest way for people to understand that would be, for instance, that everybody would admit that love exists. Yet love is not something you could touch or you could feel or is easy to quantify or even demonstrate. You can't measure it. And so when I think that love exists, is the fact that love does exist, and we know that love does exist, is essentially is evidence for the fact that material reality is simply one aspect of reality. It's not the whole thing, and in fact, it's probably not the most important aspect of reality. It is the spiritual aspects of reality, whether it's our capacity for love or for reason or for loyalty or for patience or for forgiveness, or all of those qualities that, say, define human character. Those actually are more fundamental to our being than anything related to our bodies. So as a result, is the more we define ourselves in relation to some physical characteristic, like I'm pretty, or I'm athletic, or that kind of stuff, or I'm, even by race, I'm black, the color of my skin is black, or the color of my skin is white, or by our culture, I grew up, I'm English, or I have Welsh ancestry. All of those things are marks of our material existence, our physical existence, and those things, I'm not saying that they don't exist as part of who we are, but they're secondary to who we are. They're not primary. On that
priority list, and I know that I've mentioned to you in the past that I think I was always presented as a student growing up in the United States that how did I say that before? That it was never presented to me. It was always presented to me as an either or. You're either spiritual or you're scientific.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And you can't occupy both spaces. Whether that was an intentional byproduct of my secular public education, or it's a product of my naivety. Could be either, I suppose, but I know that as a culture, I never felt that there could be coexistence between spirit and earthly identity, right? Or secular. And from a historic lens, I had the discussion with my students that maybe that came. When do you guys think that came in? And we usually go to like the Industrial Revolution, maybe Charles Darwin talking about evolution. It seems that in the West, at least, the definition of what science is belittled the definition of what spiritualism is, and it did it to denigrate it on purpose. And it has sacked a lot of spiritual curiosity out of humanity, that a lot of young people dismiss the concept of spirituality. You said something earlier about the numbers of people that align with no faith is the one that's increasing the most, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the scientific civilization that we live in actively discredits religion as a source of truth.
Yeah.
And my own understanding is that is actually an inaccurate statement. It's wrong to say that, and it reduces reality to something which is so much less than what it actually is.
Yeah.
My sense is that both science and religion are really concerned with the same goal, and that goal is the arrival of what is true. And both are valid, shall we say, in their own domains. Like, science is based upon observation through our physical senses. So I think that science is maybe the most advanced device, shall we say, ever developed to the scientific method ever developed to discern material and physical truth.
Glad you used the discern word, too.
To discern what is physically and materially true. I mean, the process itself is a hugely powerful device, and a lot of the progress, material progress that's taken place over the last few centuries is largely the result of our embrace of the scientific method. But at the same time is that the methods of, shall we say, spiritual growth, properly cultivated, lead us to understand the guiding principles of, shall we say, eternal truths or universal truths that exist independent of the material world.
So, to also succinctly say this, do you believe that certain universal truths exist for all of humanity? Is there certain set of truths that, and I don't need to identify them with you now, but the principles that people around the world, doesn't matter what demographic, what religion, what all you all are from, but that there is a starting point of commonality.
I do, and I believe that starting point has a lot to do with our own identity as human beings. I mean, take the idea of who are we as human beings. I think one truth is that we are all born, shall we say, with the seeds of a set of qualities. We all, as human beings, have some capacity for love. We all have, human beings are born with the seed of some capacity for a reason. We're all born with the capacity for forgiveness, for patience, for perseverance, for determination, for cooperation. We're all born with those qualities. They're not things that we've achieved on our own. They're actually they're inborn within us. And then those qualities are qualities that can be actively cultivated over the course of our lives. I mean, I think of it as the development of our soul. And to me, those are eternal truths. This is what pulls us together as human beings and unifies us, because all of us, to one extent or another, has the capacity to develop each one of these qualities.
There's many different questions that I have, but I guess the one that may help align this toward identifying what our own identities are constructed from. Do you or how much do you believe, if you could put it in any quantifiable way, how many people actually out there consciously think for themselves?
Well, that's a good question. I think that everyone has the capacity to do this to some extent. I'm not saying that everybody is equal. I think we are all individual. We have certain capacities. We may have more capacity in one area, less capacity in another, but I think we all have some capacity for each to develop each one of these, shall we say, character traits. And that really is the core of our spiritual identity. Having said that, is one of those capacities is the capacity to discern what is true from what is false. I think of it in a spiritual way as the capacity for justice, because that's what a justice system does. If it operates properly, it's discerning what is true from what is false. So
that's probably the biggest obstacle to today's discussion.
Well, I think that for a lot of people, understand is that for those people who, shall we say, construct our lives in the cultures of our society, think about established power, is people in power are not necessarily interested in what is true.
Yeah.
They're interested in what allows them to keep their power and to maintain more power. And one way that established power operates is by suppressing in ourselves, maybe through our educational systems, our capacity to determine what is true from what is false. Because the more we live in a state of doubt, the more willing we are to accept whatever power tells us is true.
That's clear.
And this is a real barrier to the development of ourselves and to understand ourselves and to act in the world.
Yeah. People have surrendered in many ways, knowingly or unknowingly, their own authority. They're following, I think as you wrote in one of your pieces, they're following the experts. People are so willing to follow what experts say, yet part of the frequency that we are all growingly aware of, the experts have proven time and time again to not only maybe be making mistakes, but purposefully making mistakes or purposefully making decisions that are going to impact everybody's identity.
Yeah, and I think on two levels is, first of all, experts are, shall we say, paid and therefore controlled by those people who are in power. And so therefore they're going to be emphasizing those truths which may serve power and de-emphasizing whatever truths, shall we say, do not support that power structure. And that's just something this has always existed.
Yes.
I mean, this is what human beings will do on their own without what I understand as genuine spiritual guidance. But I think it's also seeped into our educational system in the sense that, and both of us, taught high school for decades, combined them several decades. Yeah. And we know that a good grade has less to do with a student's ability to question, and engage in the process of discernment, and more to do with their blind compliance with what authority tells them is true. And so as a result, our educational systems are less about developing our capacity to know truth and more about how blindly and completely we will accept whatever those in power tell us to believe in.
And I think that is a way that my struggle in the classroom has manifested in a way where many of the things that I've learned throughout my career get me to the point in teaching, especially United States history, that a lot of what we are taught that becomes our identity, I have found out later just isn't true, or it's definitely incomplete assessment. That those powers that have created my identity or impacted my own identity have purposefully at times misled us and overtly lied to us. And that's against the concept of a spiritual principle. So I guess the idea of how are we critical enough, or can we become critical enough to realize that many of the things that we think have crafted our identity into being maybe even a strong, powerful, charismatic individual, but if some of those things that we believed because we were told them and we find out later just isn't maybe necessarily true, people are going to have to recoil from that. And that's not going to give them more, I don't know, maybe it will, the byproduct of giving them more motivation to maybe want to go explore and discern truth for themselves. But the false identity might actually need to be stripped away first. I don't know how you see that.
Well, I think that we can analyze the problems of society to death, and I think that's pretty much what people do. Is they're so concerned with identifying every possible problem, every possible obstacle, and I don't want to say that identifying the problem is unimportant.
Right.
But I think we give too much importance to analyzing the problem and not enough importance to exploring the solution. And the solution lies less in analyzing the problem than in creating systems, in this case even institutional systems, that are consistent with the truth of our identity. And so I think, to me, is that's a more constructive discussion. I know a lot of people who have analyzed all the problems of society and all the problems in the past, and yet actually contribute nothing to a solution.
That's true. I mean, I can at times want to feel myself go down those rabbit holes and get lost in revealing or being part of the discussion of how truth has been masked. But I think a more energetic, a more positive use of that time, as people, I think, like us or other people are feeling a sense of angst that something's going to have to change drastically. And when it does, what is going to come on the other side of that moment, whatever that moment presents itself as. If it's an economic collapse, if it is a revelation of evil, whatever it may be, there's going to need to be an identity check, I guess. Or is the infrastructure going to be there on the other side? And I think that's what you are talking about. And I'm excited to maybe create some of those possibilities with you.
Well, I can tell you that the infrastructure, honestly, is in place.
Yeah.
And the infrastructure for a genuinely creative process that is just, in the sense that it's consistent with the truth of our identity, is already in place. And it's in place in a worldwide level. And a whole educational system has been in the process of development for over half a century. It's not the kind of thing that too many people know about, but for some reason I'm fortunate enough to have stumbled upon it and been open to it. And it really is the educational arm is an institution called the Rui Institute, and it's based in Colombia, believe it or not. But they've developed a series of courses, which are essentially, shall we say, the foundations for a new curriculum that begin with regaining touch with our identity as most fundamentally spiritual beings. Right. The first book in the Rui series, which, by the way, the Rui Institute is, shall we say, the educational arm of the Baha'i faith, is the first course in the Rui series. It's literally called Reflections on the Life of the Spirit, which means basically it's the idea is we trace the journey of the soul from its inception into eternity through revealed writings, revealed spiritual writings. And this is a very, very powerful idea because what it's doing is, of course, it's acknowledging that people are, simply the existence of this course acknowledges, on the one hand, that identity is a major issue in society, but on the other, the emphasis is on helping people to gradually regain a more true and complete sense of who they are. And the value in this, because I've taken the course and I've facilitated the course with others, the real value in this is that once you have a clearer sense of who you are from the inside out as a human being, is then it really makes it clear sort of like what gives life meaning and purpose. And the more certain we are about what gives life meaning and purpose is the more certain we are that we can go out in the world and be actors in the creation of something new. It really is the foundation, the individual foundation for people to be able to, say, stand up with certainty and conviction and to sustain action that actually has a positive influence, in their relationships, in their families, in their communities, in their nations.
And I think we see people standing up in our culture, in our civilization from around the world now. And I think that's maybe why we in our discussion have chosen to put identity first, because so many people are wrapped up in I'm this. They want to it's not bad to categorize things for our framework of understanding, but to be stuck in those boxes that you mentally categorize people in and begin to draw conclusions from those about somebody else's identity is an approach that's going to get you nowhere. But yeah.
Well, the power of it is that I think that once we approach our identity as a human being from primarily a spiritual perspective, it's very unifying. It destroys dichotomy. So, for example, with you and I, it's easy to isolate some cultural or ethnic or religious characteristic that's secondary that would divide us. You know, for instance, I was raised in a Jewish family. You were raised in a Christian family. Well, if I identified in that way and you identified in that way, now there's some division between us. But if I understand myself as basically someone who's been born with the capacity for love, for justice, for forgiveness, for patience, and that's what makes me human, that's also what makes you human. And now, as a result, is those other things, you know, that are based on our experience, or shall we say the accidents of our birth, all those things become secondary. And they don't interfere with essentially our relationship, because our relationship is based on the connection of qualities. Like in our relationship, I know I have a very strong propensity toward the discernment of truth and finding out what is just and living within what is true. And so do you. We both share that quality. And so we both support each other in that search for truth, and that pulls us together. So my sense is that knowing this helps us to overcome a lot of the conflict and division that exists within society, and that's the beginning of social change.
And I guess the infrastructure of what has given people their identical connections, whether it be the institutions of our lives, whether it's your church, your organization, whether it's your school system, the institution of the economic system. Do you see yourself as rich, middle class, poor, somewhere on the spectrum?
Sure.
How do you see yourself within that role? Or do you believe in a victimhood mentality or conquerors? Are you parsing the world out into those things because your identity is wrapped up in your own personal belief structure, and you're going to maybe double, triple, quadruple down on that? But this is kind of a breakthrough in a way to get people to deconstruct or begin the discussion of deconstructing who they are and how they got that way. Like, as a Christian, I was raised in, but not as much practicing, and later, I think I came to the faith with a little bit more emotion attached to it, and purpose. That's a course of my own identity development, and it's not over yet. I'm not done.
No,
nobody's ever really done.
We're never done.
We're never done.
Right.
And to, I guess, live or operate in a culture where other people can identify with that state of mind is at maybe I'm always jumping to the end or the beginning with the things we talk about, but it really is imperative that we understand what the institutions are telling us too. Government, right? I didn't even mention it, but we just talked about it as a quick example. You know, you have people that are telling Americans that we should go to war in Ukraine, and with a totally incomplete understanding of what's happening.
Sure.
But you have all the powers that be that says our identity is helping other people, free peoples of the world. That's our identity. Well, come on now, right? I mean, we've already studied a lot of the things where that's not always the case. There's ulterior motives. History proves there's challenges to that identity characteristic.
Well, just on the subject of national identity, which is what you bring up in your comments, is when it comes to national identity, that's a constructed identity based on material circumstances. You know, you just happen to be physically where you were born, defines your national identity. And to understand that, I've studied the history of, say, compulsory public education as it began in Europe in the second half of the 19th century. And the reason for the public investment in schools was to inculcate in students an identity with the nation. That was the purpose that schools were created, that public schools were created and then made compulsory, so that if you happened to be born within Germany, then you identified yourself as German. Because we aren't born German. We're not born anything. We're born with love, justice, compassion. That's how we're born. You know, that kind of thing. And so loyalty to the nation, for instance, whatever nation it would be, and certainly this happens in the United States as in every other modern nation, is that then becomes the litmus test of what we're being taught in terms of how to identify ourselves, the truth about who we are. But think about this for a second. If people understood themselves primarily as a spiritual being, meaning that we're all born with certain spiritual capacities, you know, beginning with the capacity for love, is then our national identity. I'm not saying that we don't have a cultural identity. Our experiences in part doesn't become part of our culture, but it's secondary to that. My understanding is, would people be willing to fight then on behalf of a nation? Well, I think they'd be less likely to, because they're more likely to see everybody as one humanity.
And you said the historical development of the public education secular institution in the industrial age. Most Americans are unaware, or don't. Maybe they forgot this element, but most of our education system prior to that age was theologically based, especially the higher education. It was, we need to go to a university at Harvard or Princeton or wherever they were going to go, and we're going to study the Bible or theology, and we're going to discuss truth. What is it? What's the meaning of all this? And those types of discussions cultivate real, authentic experiences. And I think people at least I believe this happened to me, is that when I was going through school, that element of the discovery of truth was never emphasized, the spiritual element, right?
No.
To the detriment of spirit, science was emphasized as the only thing, if you want to be taken seriously. And who is, in our culture, if we identify with that, if we've given up on the spiritual side, like you, I think we've forgotten a whole arena that we should not only discover, but like engage with and profit by.
Well, my sense is that science is, I don't want to belittle science in any way. I just think that science has its place. There's limits to the value of scientific inquiry. And because it's based upon observation, it's limited to what our senses can observe, which is a very small portion of reality. And it's limited by what our minds can make sense of. And that, again, is a limited quantity. And so I think that so long as we understand there are limits to the kinds of truth that science has, is then we begin to understand that science needs to be guided in order to actually be a benefit to humanity. Science needs to be guided by principles which are based upon, shall we say, higher and wider truths. And those are fundamental spiritual truths. So if scientific technology, for example, was created and implemented and distributed, and the motive for that was actually to benefit humanity out of a love for humanity, is I think we'd see research and development departments doing a lot of things very differently than what they do. For sure. Most scientific technology is based upon is not based upon what is best for humanity, out of a love for humanity, because we're all one humanity that has all these qualities, but it's literally based upon the pursuit of material profit, right, in order to gain material power, because we've confined ourselves to materialism as the only possible way of seeing reality. As a result, a lot of scientific developments are extremely oppressive and actually are exploitative. You know, they really are ways of exploiting people as opposed to benefiting people.
Or used what people would, a lot of people suggested now with COVID and the world we lived in, that science may have been used and abused us. Science may have been an abuse toward us now, under the covers. And maybe that awareness can also, people can begin to extract or identify their own identity qualities and how they got those. Because I think I see several people that I know that have confided in reassessing their whole belief structure based on the last year or two. That their whole, and I'm sure you've had similar conversations with people.
Oh, yes.
And the theme in it is I just can't believe what I'm told all the time anymore. And I guess that's a step toward progress.
Well, I think that doubt is really stops progress. I think a certainty promotes progress, because no progress happens unless there's action. And the moment you're in doubt, you'll come up with every reason possibly not to act or to make a sacrifice.
Yeah.
But the moment you're clear and you're certain is the easier and more natural it is to act upon your convictions.
But what's the reaction of the institution when you act on individual convictions that butt up against the institution's message? That will be that requires those protagonists. And the challenge I see with a lot of young people is if somebody does come out and say something bold with authority and confidently, then the system may label them arrogant, or the system would say, who do you think you are, right? It won't promote the idea of individual, pursuit of truth as much.
No, I agree, but I will say this, and I think that this is why, shall we say, the kind of approach that the Rui Institute is taking is very valuable. And honestly, I want you to know that their work has been translated into 80 languages and has been in use in millions of instances across the world. And I think that the more people are, shall we say, are educated within the whole of reality, which doesn't belittle material reality, but emphasizes the spiritual components of reality, is the more that happens, shall we say, the more those external factors like institutional pressure, the more that they have less and less effect. They were less and less affected by what's happening externally or what power is doing. And so the solution is to cultivate our own spiritual qualities, because the more that they're cultivated, the more we know really who we are, shall we say, the more we're vaccinated against the abuses that are systematically taking place by people in established power. And I think this becomes really important. I know the more on a personal level, the more that I have cultivated my own, shall we say, intellectual and spiritual qualities, the less and less I am affected, shall we say, by what power says or what power does. And I have more and more strength, shall we say, to stand up for what is true and be part of a creative process that actually can be of benefit to people. So it's easy to get caught up in all of the barriers to this, but the real solution is to extract ourselves from those pressures and focus our time and energy on what is genuinely constructive. And that would start with a spiritual approach to understanding our own identity, the truth of our own identity as human beings.
Let's say, because I'm sure a lot of the students that we both have had that may be ever watching something like this, many of them have a big problem with the concept of spirit. They may believe and know to themselves and their own identity that there is no such thing. The irreligiousness of our system. What would you say to those individuals?
Well, I could tell you that kind of thing came up. I mean, I taught world history honors for a couple of decades, and that kind of question would come up when we're talking about the foundations for different civilizations over time in the world. And it's interesting, and I'm not saying that my response to it is maybe the best response, but it seemed to satisfy students. So to understand the importance of spiritual reality. So I think of one way of thinking about spiritual reality is to think about the energy that animates all living things. That's a spiritual energy. It's not something that's material or physical. So I would say without that spiritual energy, your body would be a corpse. Unless there's something that actually is animating your body, meaning there's an energy running through it from whatever source, call it whatever you will, is you are just a bunch of inert atoms subject to the laws of entropy, like everything else, proceeding toward chaos. And that's how it works. So what is it that allows you to essentially be alive?
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. And the moment I say that, everybody understands.
They get it.
They understand that.
I had an approach where I would ask the one question, DNA, I would say, right? What do we know? We know it exists.
Right.
But we've got no idea who wrote it. That reality of just the awareness that you might not know all that you think you know. Stopping points of a greater awareness of the universe being bigger than I had suspected. Or the answers,
for sure.
Maybe even some of the answers are not discoverable in the traditional way, or the way that people have sought them. That more of the better answers can maybe be found in engaging in all, and that's what I find myself doing more, is engaging in all religious writings.
For sure.
I do attend my Bible study class, but not because not for any superiority context. It's a place to engage in the moral discussions of truth and right and wrong and that kind of thing.
The things that guide our lives. Just like the energy animates our body, those principles guide. Those principles allow us to move in a direction. Their guidance. And the moment that guidance is missing from our education, the moment our lives have no direction.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty much the state of modern society today, is people make money, and they wonder what for at a certain point, because their lives are not moving in a direction. Without the guidance, without the energy that animates our body, we cannot walk. But in the same way, without the guidance from the source of that spirit, without being open and receiving the guidance of that truth and cultivating the qualities we have, is our life can have no meaning and purpose. It doesn't move in a direction. And to me, this is really fundamentally important. And unfortunately, I mean, it's wonderful that we have a forum here that we can talk about it. But in society today, it's not the kind of thing which is really, shall we say, acceptable in public discourse.
They're not opening the discussion, they're narrowing it.
Yes, exactly. Because the moment you see reality in purely material terms is now you've confined it in a way which actually has little or nothing to do with the whole of reality.
That's the arrogant thing. That's the arrogance, is to narrow that thing.
Right.
The people that we highlight and I love to study in history are the change agents in the world.
Sure.
Who have sought, I think, a greater spiritual understanding. I often talk about Buddha and Christ and other, Confucius and many other spiritual leaders that I just believe it, that God touched those individuals and gave them a special purpose, and there's oneness and there's unity in all of it, and there's brotherhood in all of that.
Oh, for sure. Right.
But even sometimes those that are within the institution, some of the things we may end up learning in the future, that the institutions have been run by some individuals that they just don't have the spiritual goal in mind. It's more of a form of control.
Right. And I will say this, is I know that when I first started teaching world history, I really didn't appreciate the value of spiritual principles or guiding guiding religious principles in the advance of civilization. But the better I came to understand the dynamic of historical progress, is the more I saw that with every single civilization, is the root of their progress was a unity of thought that was based upon guiding principles which were fundamentally spiritual. And this begins really with, for instance, the Ten Commandments. In history, the idea of an ethical monotheism that the Israelites, the Hebrews, brought into what would become the land of Israel, is that was a foundation for the cooperation of human beings at a level that that human beings were incapable of before, because monotheism, the idea that God is a unity, there's a unity, there's one creator, essentially unifies all thought in the civilization around one set of principles. And therefore, now progress is possible. And it's easy to see that in any civilization, it's a building upon that base.
It is, but I always like to question and challenge not that, but the idea that today young people are often told, or I hear adults say it, that you can choose your own reality, you can choose your own truth.
Well, I think we all admit that today our society is in a process of decline. Everybody understands this. Everyone understands that that in some way, shape, or form is that the organization of our society has become less and less in touch with what is true or what is just.
Yeah.
But I think when you think about what is the source of that, it's essentially over the last several centuries, really since the European Enlightenment, is religious and spiritual principles, and even moral principles, have become discredited. To the point where people are left with trying to discern, quote, the truth of their own selves or their own moral principles, because there is no guidance that allows people to come together in a cooperation that can essentially permit society to move forward.
Yeah.
So a lot of the disintegration we see in society today is really about the absence of unifying principles that are pulling people together in unity.
Yeah. I think we all feel that. We all see it. We all feel it. I wish we had an immediate solution, but there isn't one.
No.
I think people might in our culture also maybe be looking for some sort of an immediate,
I think
like
there's
a white knight to come in and
for sure. I think people are really in the process of looking in their own ways, but I think for a lot of people they don't know where to look.
Yeah.
They don't know how to look. They've never developed the capacities that they need in order to engage in this search, from the most fundamental levels. But I do want to say is that though filling that gap essentially is the function of the Rui Institute's work over the last 50 years, is essentially filling the gap between what we should have been learning in our families, in our homes, in our schools, in order to be creative members of society who could move society forward and didn't.
Right.
And now they're going back and saying, this is the gap that we have to fill. Yeah. And I remember asking one of my own mentors, someone I look up to because he's just very deepened and very mature, very knowledgeable. And I asked him, I said, what does this process of social change really look like? And how do you explain it to people? And what he told me, he said, what we're involved in, of course, and he also, like me, is a member of the Baha'i community, he said, what we're involved in is the process of changing the world one heart at a time. And really, any fundamental, sustainable, lasting change is going to happen in personal relationship. And I think that that's just, it might not be what we want to happen, but it's all going to happen from the bottom up, starting with the individual, moving to the relationships between individuals, moving to within families, within neighborhoods, within communities. And it's all going to happen. It has to happen from the bottom up to be the kind of fundamental and sustainable and constructive change that actually that people are really looking for.
I think they are. That's a pretty good. That's a pretty good place for part one.
I think so too.
Yeah, I think we'll get after it again sometime.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Right.
Hopefully, next time we could talk beyond the individual to how the transformation of the way we see relationship.
I think prioritizing
Right.
The individual first. You can't have a decent community if the individuals are rotten. And I'm not using rotten language. Just
No.
the idea that you haven't had a chance to experience cultivating your own identity, and maybe haven't been exposed to those gap years of things that have been happening. And
Right. It's like we want to say we could transform society, but until we transform ourselves first and raise our capacity, then we really haven't developed the ability to be a constructive agent in the transformation of society. So it really does have to start with our own individual and spiritual development. It just has to.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, thanks,
we'll
Matt.
Say goodbye for now. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks,
today,
Matt.
Rob.
It's
yes,
fun.
Sir. We'll do it again.
I hope so.